In 2016, 23-year-old tourist Todd Peterson disappeared in the mountains of Arizona. A year later, he was found. His body was tied to a tree, and only a strange, ritualistic symbol lay on the ground. At first glance, it looks like the work of a loner, but why was the murder committed with surgical precision? We will reveal the true story of the Watcher who used fanaticism to protect the desert. Disappearance in Gila Canyon. I can still feel the Arizona sun burning, even though 9 years have passed. I am Detective Reynolds, and I will never forget 2016. The whole story began with a trivial disappearance, which at first seemed like just another case of someone overestimating their abilities. In July 2016, Todd Peterson, a 23-year-old junior from Phoenix, decided to challenge himself. 3 days alone, in a remote part of the Superstition Mountains, along the Rivas Ranch Trail. These mountains are not just rocks. They are a labyrinth of shadows, sun-scorched earth, and legends of gold. Todd, like most city dwellers, saw them only as the perfect backdrop for a selfie, not understanding their true essence. He left his old Nissan Sentra in the Peralta Trailhead parking lot. The last confirmed contact was on July 12th at 6:40 a.m. He was caught on camera at the roadside stop gas station in Apache Junction. He bought a large coffee, an energy bar, and, as seen in the blurry recording, took a quick photo of himself in front of the sign. His mother later confirmed that it was a selfie he posted online, writing, "Be back in 72 hours. Don't look for me if something goes wrong." Of course, it was youthful bravado, but it turned out to be prophetic. 3 days later, with his car still sitting in the parking lot under the merciless sun and his phone was not answering, the Pinal County Sheriff's Office initiated a search. I arrived there the next morning. The air was still, heavy with the smell of hot sand and dry chaparral. In the parking lot, I saw his Sentra, neatly parked, clean, as if the owner had just stepped away. We launched a full-scale operation. Rescuers, dogs, a helicopter with a thermal imager, the standard kit for a desert rescue. We combed the Rivas Ranch Trail, which leads through dry creeks to Gila Canyon. It was exhausting work. The temperature during the day exceeded 100 degrees. On the third day of the search, a mile from the main trail, we found his camp. It was near a fork that led to an abandoned section of Gila Canyon, a place where tourists don't usually go. His tent was neatly pitched, even meticulously, as if according to instructions. Inside was a sleeping bag, a stove, and a supply of dry food. There was no sign of a struggle, panic, or haste. Nothing. The only things missing were Todd himself, his backpack, his phone, and the small diary that, according to his mother, he always carried with him. The search dogs, which had been confidently following the scent, were confused at the tent. The trail had simply disappeared, broken off as if the man had vanished into thin air. That evening, standing over this perfectly tidy camp, I realized that this was no typical disappearance. Todd Peterson didn't get lost. He was taken. Or he left on his own. But why did he leave his tent and everything he needed to survive? This thought was the first crack in my worldview. I could hear only the rustling of dry grass and the heavy breathing of my people. The desert was silent, but its silence was louder than any scream. Exactly 1 year has passed. The summer of 2017 brought me only routine paperwork that had piled up after Todd Peterson's case was classified as unsolved. I couldn't forget that perfectly tidy tent and the emptiness around it. As an experienced detective, I knew that when nature takes a person, it always leaves traces. Torn clothes, signs of a struggle, or at least a pool of blood. Here, there was only silence. The breakthrough came in July. 2 hikers who were bushwhacking, traversing through thickets without trails, in a remote part of Tortilla Creek Canyon, about 10 miles from the initial search area, stumbled upon something horrific. When I arrived at the scene, I felt a cold wave run down my spine, despite the heat. The remains lay in a deep, sun-protected ravine, as if the location had been chosen deliberately. It was a skeleton, brutally and securely tied to an old, sun-scorched ponderosa pine tree. The rope securing the body was thick, synthetic, with knots tied with almost professional precision. I immediately noted that this was not the work of panic. The forensic experts worked slowly, with jeweler's precision. After several hours, we had confirmation. Using dental records and DNA samples, we identified the remains as those of Todd Pedersen. A year had passed, and the desert had given us back only bones. But not just bones. The body was incomplete. Both arms were missing, amputated at the shoulder joint. There were no signs that this had been done by predators. On the contrary, the cuts were too even and clean. It looked like surgical work. On the ground, right under the pine tree where the skeleton had been found, lay a single object. It was not accidental. It was a small, neatly carved wooden cross, carved from juniper, with a symbol burned into it. The symbol resembled an Indian petroglyph, a circle with 3 curved lines inside, like a crying eye. The cross lay flat, as if it had been placed there as a marker. I led the investigation, realizing that we were no longer looking for a lost tourist. We were dealing with someone who seemed to be acting according to their own cruel ritual. We classified him as Suspect Alpha, based on a single clue: a local recluse who was often seen in the Tortilla Creek Canyon area. The locals called him Jack Shadow Garner. He lived in a makeshift hut high in the mountains, avoiding people and known for his hostility toward tourists. We found him 2 days later. He was dirty, wearing old torn clothes with long, unkempt hair. During questioning, he behaved aggressively, almost hysterically, shouting about the sanctity of the land and punishment for desecrators. We obtained a search warrant for his hut. The findings were promising: various ropes and cables, including one coil identical in material and thickness to the one used to tie Todd, a homemade, roughly carved knife with a thick blade. In an old notebook littered with rubbish, we found a sketch of a symbol, a circle with 3 lines. His drawing was clumsy but recognizable. At first glance we had caught our maniac, a rough recluse who hates people, draws symbols, and has the right rope. The perfect false trophy, as I called it to myself. However, when I reviewed the pathologist's report, serious doubts arose. The amputation of the hands was performed with surgical precision. Dr. Ramirez's report stated, an extremely sharp instrument, scalpel or laser cutter, was used with knowledge of anatomy. The cut muscles and tendons show minimal damage to surrounding tissue. Such precision did not fit the profile of a rough hermit wielding a homemade knife. Moreover, on the pine tree where the skeleton was tied, we found deep claw marks from a large bird of prey that had clearly fed on the remains. This indicated that the body had been left for a period of time after the amputation, serving as bait or worse, as part of a desert cleansing ritual. Jack Garner was arrested on suspicion of trespassing and violating the rules of the protected area, but not for murder. I was tormented by the feeling that Garner's shadow was just a diversion, or perhaps an accomplice who had been used. Someone else was there, someone educated, methodical, and undoubtedly more dangerous. While Garner sat in his cell, screaming about curses, I stared at the photo of the ritual cross. The answer was somewhere in that symbol. There are no coincidences in the desert. There are only shadows. I spent 2 days in the office, ignoring calls from senior management demanding an immediate announcement of the arrest of Todd Pedersen's killer. They were all convinced that Jack Garner, the Shadow, was our man. He was the perfect candidate for the media: a crazy recluse, a tourist hater, a rope found, a symbol drawn. But I couldn't believe it. My doubts were based on 2 facts: the surgical precision of the amputation and the silent consent of the desert. I reread the report by the pathologist, Dr. Ramirez. He found traces of the claws of a large bird of prey, probably a golden eagle, on Pedersen's bones. This confirmed that the body had been exposed and served as food. But the key was something else. The amputation of the arms had been performed with extraordinary cleanliness. The cuts were neat, as if made with a scalpel or a high-precision laser instrument, with minimal damage to the tissue around the joint. I called Dr. Ramirez. "Tell me honestly, doctor," I asked, laying out the photos of Pedersen's hands in front of him. "Could this have been done by a man who, according to our information, uses a roughly sharpened knife and lives in a shack without electricity?" Ramirez shook his head. "Detective, this is not the work of a cutter. This is the work of someone who either has extensive medical experience or access to professional tools that can provide such precision. This is not the work of a vandal. It is art, albeit horrific." There was a contradiction here. Jack Garner, our suspect alpha, was a rough, uneducated, possibly mentally ill recluse. We found a homemade knife in his shack, but it was too thick and blunt for such work. His drawings of the symbol were uneven and hastily done, unlike the neatly burned mark on the cross. The Garner I saw had no skill and seemed to lack even the physical strength to carry Pedersen's body 10 miles through the canyon and fix it so methodically. I returned to analyzing the symbol, a wooden cross with a burned mark. It was not like the usual marks left by hikers or tourists. It was a circle with 3 curved lines diverging from the center, like rays of sunlight or drops. I sent a photo of the symbol to the Archival Investigations Department, noting its similarity to Native American petroglyphs, as suggested by our forensic expert. A day later, I received a call. It was not a petroglyph, it was an emblem. "Detective, we checked the archives. It's the symbol of the Disciples of the Sun," the archivist told me. "A small religious group that was active in Arizona in the 1990s. They were an offshoot of a Christian cult, but quickly became fanatical. Their doctrine was sacrifice for the purity of the desert. They believed that the desert was sick from the presence of unclean people and needed to be cleansed through ritual acts. They disappeared from the radar in the late 90s after their leader died in the Copper Basin quarry." This was the clue that broke the circle of suspicion surrounding Garner. The recluse had no connection to the religious cults of the 90s. Someone had deliberately used an old, forgotten symbol. I quickly reviewed the materials on the Disciples of the Sun. The photographs found in the Gila County Police Archives showed their camp, homemade altars, people in simple clothes praying. And among these photographs was one that made my heart beat faster. The picture showed a young man, about 25 years old, thin, with a fanatical expression on his face, holding a wooden cross in his hands. His cross. It was identical to the one we found under Pedersen's body. The archive entry identified him as Ryan Rip Sims. 35 years old at the time of our search. A former paramedic, he was a follower of the cult who, it turned out, had a nervous breakdown after the leader's death. Sims was discharged from the clinic in Mesa and had access to medical instruments, medical training, fanatical cult, surgical precision, a symbol. I could feel the pieces of the puzzle coming together. Ryan Sims became Suspect Beta, the new prime suspect. Garner's shadow was just a dirty but innocent decoy, or perhaps someone Sims used as a distraction. I called my superiors, and this time my tone was decisive. Forget the recluse. The hunt was on, and the target was a man who believed he was doing something sacred with his scalpel. Identifying Ryan Sims as Suspect Beta opened up a whole new level of crime for us. He wasn't just a maniac in the woods, but a methodical fanatic with medical training, which made him far more dangerous than he appeared. I immediately contacted the FBI, as the case was quickly growing beyond the jurisdiction of the county. FBI profilers quickly compiled a portrait of Sims. After the death of cult leader Caleb Stone in the 90s, Ryan presumably had a traumatic experience of loss. His fanaticism did not disappear, but transformed into a more radical individual form, where he himself became the guardian of the purity of the desert. His ambition was not simply to kill, but to perform a ritual that involved surgical skills and symbols. What we found on the pine tree was his sacrificial architecture. Sims became the central figure in the hunt, and Shadow Garner, who was still sitting in his cell, became his possible pawn. I ordered a check of any contacts between Sims and Garner. This was difficult because both lived outside the normal social system. We discovered that Sims had not disappeared without a trace. He had made several purchases at tourist and building supply stores in small towns such as Gold Canyon and Superior over the past 5 years. His medical records indicated that he suffered from paranoia and an excessive obsession with the cleanliness of his environment. This was consistent with the ideology of the Disciples of the Sun cult, which called for the purification of the desert. The next step was geographical tracking. By analyzing old records of the cult's activities and Sims's recent transactions, we narrowed the search area to the territory around Pinal Peak. This was an area known for its abandoned mines, including the legendary Old Dutchman mine. Sims, as a former paramedic, had survival skills, and the abandoned mines could serve as ideal shelters, protected from the heat and prying eyes. I formed a small rapid response team, which was joined by FBI agents. We used high-resolution aerial reconnaissance to find any anomalies in the rocky landscape. The desert is not a forest where you can hide under thick foliage. In the desert, everything is visible if you know where to look. On the 4th day of the search, a drone spotted a suspicious object in a remote branch of the canyon near the ruins of the Old Dutchman mine. It was a small, perfectly camouflaged bunker, the entrance to which was hidden under rocks and dry chaparral. The bunker was built using old mine structures, and its roof was covered with sand and rocks to match the surrounding landscape. We stormed it at dawn. Such places can be mined or have hidden traps, but this time the bunker was empty. However, it had been abandoned in a hurry, albeit in an orderly fashion, just as he had done with Pedersen's camp. The atmosphere inside was eerie. The walls were covered with drawings, schematic images of people labeled desecrators, and numerous symbols of the Disciples of the Sun. On a table made of battered boards we found a set of medical instruments. I saw it right away. Scalpels, clamps, surgical threads. Everything was clean, sterile, in perfect order. This confirmed that Sims was a surgeon. Pedersen's photographs. Several pictures of Todd taken from a distance, on the trail, a few hours before his disappearance. Sims, like a true predator, watched his prey. Sims' diary. It was a thick, dusty notebook filled with uneven, fanatical handwriting. The last entry in the diary was from this morning. It was not a cry of despair, but an ultimatum. I read it to the agents. "The desert awaits. My purification is almost complete. I will not hide like those unclean ones. I will hand him over if you come to me in Queen Creek Canyon before the first sunrise. Otherwise, I will complete the cleansing, and the seeds of the desert will be planted, and its enemies will be left without their essence." Sims made it clear he was not running away, but setting a meeting place, and he had with him what was probably the final trophy, the mummified hands of Todd Pedersen. Queen Creek Canyon. It was a new point on the map. But my doubts about Garner wouldn't leave me alone. Sims was the executor, but was he the real overseer? Who led him to Pedersen, who had so clearly documented his route to the little-known Gila Canyon? It occurred to me, Todd didn't just post a selfie at a gas station. He had a journal. We obtained a search warrant for Todd Pedersen's car, which was stored at the police impound lot. In the glove compartment, under the seat, we found a small leather-bound notebook, his journal. In it, Todd had detailed his route, including a secret trail to Gila Canyon that he had found on an old map. A trail that, as he wrote, was known only to locals who work in the park. It was a clue that neither Sims nor Garner had. Neither of them worked for the National Park Service. I looked at the page of the diary, feeling the story begin to turn on its own axis. The discovery of Todd Pedersen's diary in his car and Ryan Sims's ultimatum completely turned the case around. Sims was just the executor, a figure who was perfect for ritualistic amputation, but he wasn't the one who could have known about the secret trail to Gila Canyon that Todd wrote about in his private diary. I looked at Todd's notes and the map. It showed a small, almost invisible trail that deviated from the main Rivas Ranch trail route. Todd had entrusted this information only to paper, and he had left the paper in his car. Who could have known that this diary existed and that it contained a description of the route? According to the instructions, Todd left his car in the Peralta Trailhead parking lot. The only National Park Service employee who worked regularly in this area and saw Todd Peterson post his selfie and set off on the trail was the campground caretaker. I reviewed the disappearance materials again. July 12, 2016, 6:40 a.m. Selfie at the gas station. 7 a.m. Registration at the parking lot. Todd was seen by the ranger on duty who was registering visitors, as well as the campground caretaker. We focused on the Peralta Trailhead campground attendant. His name was Elias Woods, 50 years old, with 15 years of experience working for the Park Service. At first glance, he seemed like the perfect employee, quiet, knowledgeable about the trails, friendly. But there was one notable detail in his file. He was the one who knew all the forgotten or secret trail branches. Woods often boasted about his knowledge of the canyon. He became Suspect Gamma. But if Woods was the overseer, what was his place in this hierarchy? Why was Sims, a former paramedic and cult fanatic, the executor? I decided to return to Suspect Alpha, the recluse Jack Shadow Garner, who was still in prison for minor offenses. The rope found in his shack was identical to the one used to tie up Peterson. It couldn't have been a coincidence. I arrived at the Pinal County Jail. Garner's interrogation was intense and supervised by a psychologist. I didn't mention Sims. I only talked about Peterson and the rope. I painted a picture for him, how he walked through the thicket, how he tied the body to the ponderosa pine. I pressed him. "You were there, Jack. That's your rope. Someone knew you would do it, and someone gave you the tool." Garner began to scream, then shake, and then suddenly fell silent. His gaze became empty, as if the lights had been turned off. He fell into a stupor. The psychologist gestured for him to stop. But in this catatonic silence, Jack Garner suddenly began to speak, monotonously, without any emotion, as if repeating someone else's words. He knew where the trail was. He knew where the trail was. I leaned toward him. "Who, Jack? Who knew where the trail was?" Garner was silent, but the psychologist made a note. His reaction was not to the rope, but to the very fact that the secret of the route had been revealed. It was a reaction to authority. I pieced together the facts. Todd Peterson had published his trip on the internet, but had hidden the details in his diary. Elias Woods saw Todd Peterson leave his diary in his car in the parking lot. Elias Woods, as a caretaker, knew about the secret branches of the trails that Todd wrote about. Ryan Sims, a cult fanatic with medical training, had the skills for ritual amputation. Jack Garner, a recluse, was used as a diversion and possibly as an assistant for the dirty work, carrying the body, ropes. The scheme became clear. Elias Woods, a disillusioned campground caretaker who had watched tourists desecrate his desert for 15 years, chose Todd Peterson as the perfect victim for his arrogance. He saw the diary, learned the route, and passed it on to Ryan Sims, his cleansing agent, a former patient whom he had convinced of the need for a cleansing ritual. Under Woods's direction, Sims kidnapped Peterson, performed the amputation, and possibly with the help of Garner, Suspect Alpha, displayed the body on a ponderosa pine tree as a false trophy. Woods was the real mastermind behind the crime, Suspect Gamma. He exploited Sims's religious fanaticism and Garner's silence to carry out his own fanatical plan. I immediately informed the FBI that our real enemy was not a lone maniac, but a watcher who knew all our moves in advance. We had less than a day to get to Queen Creek Canyon before Sims completed the purge. But now we knew who had pulled Peterson off his secret trail. The night was cold, but the tension inside me was higher than any desert temperature. We didn't sleep. We moved. Ryan Sims's ultimatum left us no choice. Before the first sunrise in Queen Creek Canyon. I knew we weren't going for an arrest, but for a ritual climax. I, Detective Reynolds, led the operation, along with a small but highly skilled FBI team. All we had was an encrypted map found in Sims' bunker and my knowledge of the area. I was also confident that our real enemy was Elias Woods, the overseer, who had to be there to witness the completion of the cleansing. We reached Queen Creek Canyon an hour before dawn. The rocks were dark silhouettes against the eastern sky, which was already beginning to turn gray. There was a deep, almost absolute silence, broken only by the rustling of our equipment. The canyon was much deeper and more remote than Tortilla Creek, a place that was ideal for hiding a crime that required cleanliness. Using thermal imaging, we quickly located the site. It was a small, perfectly circular area at the edge of the canyon, surrounded by weathered rocks. The perfect place for a ceremony. We split into 3 groups. Myself and 2 agents took up a position at a height to monitor the situation. The other 2 groups slowly descended to surround the site. Every move was carefully calculated. We knew Sims might be armed, but his fanatical unpredictability was a greater threat. As the first rays of sunlight touched the horizon, I saw them. 2 figures stood on the platform. In the center was an old, weathered stone altar, a natural monolith that had probably been used for rituals for centuries. The first figure I identified was Ryan Sims. He was thin, dressed in dirty clothes, with long, tousled hair. He stood like a statue, holding an old military backpack in his hands. I sensed that Todd Pedersen's mummified hands were inside. Even from a distance, his eyes looked wild, filled with paranoid fanaticism. The second figure was unexpectedly clean. A man in his 50s, dressed in a neat field uniform similar to a ranger's, but without any insignia. He stood a few steps away, watching Sims. There was undisguised authority in his posture. This was Elias Woods. Woods was not dirty like the recluse Garner, nor did he look crazy like Sims. He looked like a leader, like a teacher. He was calm, almost serene. Sims began to speak, his voice reaching us as a distorted echo, but I could make out the key words. He spoke of sacrifice, of desecration, and of the seed of the desert. It was a fanatical sermon, a religious monologue that was obviously the culmination of his purification. Woods just nodded, gesturing with his hand from time to time as if directing Sims's performance. This confirmed my theory. Woods was the overseer, using Sims as a tool. I gave the signal. Prepare to capture. At that moment, Sims raised his backpack above his head as if he were about to throw it into the canyon. "The purification is complete. Now the unclean will have no substance," he exclaimed. I jumped out of my hiding place. "Police, get on the ground! Hands behind your head!" It all happened in an instant. Wood's reaction was as calm as Sims was hysterical. Woods smiled slightly, raised his hands in complete submission, and took a step back, as if distancing himself from everything that was happening. Sims, driven to extremes, was not afraid of us, but of Woods. His paranoia, which we had seen in his diary, had kicked in. He interpreted our appearance as interference by the unclean and probably blamed his teacher for it. He dropped his backpack, which rolled across the ground, and instead of surrendering, he rushed in the opposite direction, toward the edge of the canyon. "You will not complete the purification," he shouted, but not at us, but at Woods, whose face remained calm. Sims couldn't stop at the edge. The ground beneath him collapsed. I saw his thin body disappear into the deep ravine. Any attempt to retrieve him would have been suicidal. We had lost Ryan Sims, the source of our conflict, but perhaps not the source of truth. Woods offered no resistance. When the agents approached him, he just stood there, staring at the ravine where Sims had just disappeared. I picked up the backpack. Inside, neatly wrapped in old cloth, were the mummified hands of Todd Pedersen. They were perfectly preserved, as if displayed in some macabre museum. When I returned to Woods, he looked me straight in the eye and said with a smile, "Now the desert is cleansed and its new seeds are planted." I knew he would follow me. He was my first disciple. He spoke like a true cult leader, convinced of his righteousness. We arrested him for murder. But at that moment, I understood. True evil never has blood on its hands. It always stands by and just watches. The arrest of Elias Woods marked the end of one of the most methodical and fanatical cases I have ever encountered. His calmness at the edge of the canyon, his smile as Ryan Sims fell into the ravine, all of this confirmed that we were dealing with a true watcher. He was confident that his mission was complete and that our presence only confirmed his success. Elias Woods, a former campground caretaker, was charged with the murder of Todd Pedersen, and later, thanks to the seizure of his personal records, we were able to prove his involvement in the disappearance of 2 other solo hikers who had gone missing in the Superstition Mountains years earlier. His motive, unlike Sims's religious fanaticism, was more cynical and pathological. He believed in fanatically protecting the desert from desecrators. For Woods, every solo hiker who published their routes and left trash behind was arrogant and needed to be cleansed. At trial, Woods pleaded not guilty, but did not deny the fact of cleansing. He behaved coldly and methodically, explaining his actions as necessary surgery to save the desert. He described in detail how he chose his victims. He checked social media for arrogant posts, watched Todd Pedersen leave his journal in a parking lot, and learned about a secret trail that Woods himself knew as a park ranger. Ryan Sims, whose body was found at the bottom of the ravine a few days later, was just a tool. Woods, it turned out, had been his spiritual mentor after Sims was discharged from the clinic. Woods convinced the fanatical Sims that the ideas of the disciples of the Sun cult could only be realized through purification rituals, which required Sims's surgical precision. The mummified hands of Todd Pedersen that were found became the main piece of evidence. For Woods, it was not just a trophy, but part of his sowing ritual, the rejection of the unclean from the desert. Thanks to the evidence gathered, including Sims's diaries and the testimony of Jack Garner, who was eventually released, recognized only as an accomplice in the cover-up, not the killer. Elias Woods was convicted of the murder of Todd Pedersen and 2 other missing tourists. He received several life sentences. At the sentencing, he showed no emotion, only a slight smile, as if his imprisonment was part of some grand plan that was beyond our comprehension. The Todd Pedersen case was closed, but its consequences went far beyond the courtroom. Todd's mother, a woman who had endured 2 years of uncertainty and a shocking discovery, created a memorial fund. This fund began to cooperate with the police and the National Park Service. Our main lesson was the price of publicizing the route. Woods took advantage of the internet and the trust of tourists, so the Todd Pedersen Foundation began conducting training sessions that emphasized the dangers of over-documenting your exact routes on social media, especially in remote areas. It was ironic. Todd, who sought fame online, unwittingly gave his killer his exact coordinates. I left the service a few years later, but every time I see the Superstition Mountains, I think of Woods. I realize that it is not a crazy hermit, but a methodical, educated man with a sense of superiority who is the most dangerous predator. The desert that gave us Todd Pedersen will never be the same. We found his body and arrested the killer, but somewhere in the Superstition Mountains, among the rocks and dry chaparral, Woods's shadow remains. A shadow that silently watches and waits for the next person who talks too loudly about where they are going. And that makes me grit my teeth every time I look at the desert and remember the first rule of survival. Never tell anyone where you're going.